After exploring the history of Sega's greatest mistake, let's take a look into the history of perhaps Sega's crowning achievement that, unfortunately for them, was never really able to take off. Today, we are going to be taking a deep look into Sega's 7th and final home console, the Dreamcast. The year 1998. Rumors of two new consoles have begun to swirl around. The first, a successor to the global hit the PlayStation, aptly named PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2 is rumored to have backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 1, a DVD player, and even internet connectivity. The second, another attempt by Sega to grab hold of the market that they had lost. Not a successor to the Saturn, but something completely different. Something using more off-the-shelf parts, no partnerships, and a brand new ahead-of-its-time system. Little did anyone know that these rumors of a newer, faster, and overall better Sega console would come to fruition by the end of 1998 in Japan. The Dreamcast was Sega's final effort to come back into the console wars that had whittled itself down to just three competitors: Nintendo, Sony, and now Sega. NEC, SNK, Atari, and Panasonic all had their own attempts at consoles throughout the 16-bit and 32-bit eras, but by the end of the 6th generation of home consoles, there would only be 3 companies remaining. Unfortunately for Sega, they would not be one of them. The failure of the Saturn sent Sega's financial state into a freefall. Releasing the Saturn and the 32X at around the same time made them lose customers. Along with that, the Saturn was expensive to buy and difficult to develop for. After coming off of the success of the Sega Genesis, it seemed like Sega had managed to take all of the wrong turns. Sega decided that they didn't really want to give up, and instead they wanted to give it one more shot. They looked at the failings of the Saturn, a dual CPU and dual GPU configuration that made it hard to develop for, not so great development tools in general, and a poorly timed and configured American launch. And from those 3 issues, they decided to learn from their mistakes and fix them. So, where do you start when creating a brand new console? The hardware, of course. Starting in 1997, 2 teams at Sega were tasked with developing new console hardware. The project, known internally as Katana, had one group, led by Hideki Sato, developing for it. It also had another group led by Tatsuyo Yamamoto. To start, Sato decided to use the Hitachi SH4 as the primary processor, and the VideoLogic Power VR2 graphics processor, which was manufactured by NEC. The SH4 was needed since they were gunning for a more powerful CPU that could do the geometry processing required for polygon creation. The 128-bit chip operated at 200 MHz and included a vector graphic computational engine with a 64-bit floating point unit, a 32-bit fixed point unit, and a DMA controller. The DMA controller allows the SH4 to access VRAM and would allow for the Power VR2 to access main RAM, helping with high-speed packet transfers between main RAM and VRAM. What is interesting about the SH4 was that it was actually used in the Sega Naomi arcade boards at the exact same clock rate. Naomi also happened to have an updated Power VR2 graphics processor. However, Naomi costed $1,995, a much steeper price than Katana's eventual MSRP. Yamamoto's team, on the other hand, decided to go a completely different route with their hardware, using a Motorola PowerPC 603E CPU and a 3DFX Voodoo 2 and Voodoo Banshee as the GPU. The 603E also hit 200 MHz but could hit 300 MHz at a TDP of 6 watts. Besides that, it was a much more off-the-shelf counterpart to the SH4. However, Sega eventually told Yamamoto's team to change the processor to match Sato's team, mainly because Sega had a good relationship with Hitachi, which now had both teams working with the SH4. The GPUs, on the other hand, are where the main difference was. Yamamoto and his team decided on the Voodoo 2 and the Voodoo Banshee that would work in tandem with each other. The Banshee is a 2D only graphics card, whereas the Voodoo 2 was a 3D accelerator that needed to work with the Banshee to make 3D graphics. At the end of the day though, the Power VR card that Sato would choose ended up being more powerful than the Voodoo 2 at the time, with features like automatic translucency sorting, normal map bump mapping, better bandwidth utilization, and a few other features that would make the image quality overall better than the Voodoo 2. In fact, the Power VR, due to tile rendering architecture, has a higher fill rate and overall faster polygon rendering throughput than even the Voodoo 3, which wouldn't release until 1999. By the end of development, Katana was even able to render a peak of 5 million polygons per second with its game engine performance. Compare that to the GeForce 256, which would peak at 2.9 million polygons per second. On paper, Katana at the time of release was incredibly powerful, and even more powerful than some of the highest end PCs on the market. However, there was one thing that seemed to ultimately sour the deal of Katana using the 3DFX chip. Besides the Voodoo 2 just generally being a little less powerful, the main thing was that in 1997, 3DFX themselves went public with their IPO. Now, this allowed for regular stock market shenanigans, but this also meant that they had to unveil its contracts with Sega. In turn, the public now knew about the development of Project Katana, which obviously angered Sega of Japan executives. It's likely that due to this decision, Sega of Japan decided to cut ties with 3DFX altogether and ultimately decided to go with Sato's team and the NEC-designed Power VR for their next home console. Due to this release of their contracts, the rumor mill had started, letting everyone know that Sega's newest console was indeed coming. With the brains and the brawn of Katana selected, Sega needed to choose the rest of the specifications. For the media that would be used, Sega ultimately decided on the GD-ROM system over the CD-ROM and the very expensive DVD-ROM. GD-ROM allowed for 1 GB of data on disk compared to the maximum 650 megabits of storage on the CD-ROM. Comparing that to DVD-ROM, DVD-ROM actually allowed for 1.46 GB of storage. Along with new cutting-edge features like better graphics, GD-ROM, and being the first 128-bit system, Project Katana also had something that was quite ahead of its time: internet capabilities. With a 56K modem built right into the console, this actually makes the Dreamcast the first console to ship with one built in. And with that, the Dreamcast even had a fully functioning web browser and email client. The ability to connect to the internet ultimately had a huge impact on games that released for the console. Many games shipped with some sort of internet functionality, whether that be downloadable content for Sonic Adventure or full-on multiplayer capabilities like in Phantasy Star Online. Other than simple internet connectivity, the Dreamcast also had a pretty nifty gadget up its sleeve. This device was called the Virtual Memory Unit, or VMU for short. These little memory card type guys plugged directly into your Dreamcast controller and acted like, you guessed it, a memory card. The difference between a regular memory card and the VMU, however, was that the VMU had buttons. Unplugging the VMU from the controller shows a D-pad and buttons that allowed the player to not only manage their saves directly, but interact with what game saves they had. Playing minigames, taking care of Chow from Sonic Adventure, the possibilities were endless. Project Katana throughout development started to become what modern consoles are now: lower cost PCs. The hardware that was being used in Katana fell more in line with PCs of the era, and this in turn helped reduce the cost of the console. Furthering this parallel, Microsoft helped develop a custom version of Windows CE for Katana that had DirectX API and Dynamic Link libraries. Doing this made Katana an easy sell for people looking to port PC games over to the console. Sega, however, would provide superior development tools at the end of the day, so most developers would use that instead. Ahead of launch, Sega went ahead and spent $50 to $80 million on hardware development, $150 to $200 million on software development, and $300 million on worldwide promotion. Before you launch a console, however, you have to announce it. Though rumors of this so-called Project Katana had begun circulating in 1997 due to the contracts with 3DFX, Sega was still staying very tight-lipped on their new project. With the Saturn being a moderate success in Japan, it was mainly the rest of the world that had rejected the console. Sega took their time to learn from their mistakes, to get easy-to-use hardware and easy-to-use software, making it a dream to program for compared to the Saturn. Many reports of the console were going around, and all of them included these facts as well. With the hardware, software, and everything else done, what was left for Sega's new console? Well, the name, for starters. Sega had decided to hold a public competition to name the new system and ended up with over 5,000 names to consider before finally landing on the name Dreamcast. The name Dreamcast is actually a portmanteau of the words dream and broadcast. According to employee Katsutoshi Iguchi, a game developer by the name of Kenji Ino, famous for Real Sound and the survival horror series D and D2, submitted the name and the spiral logo for the Dreamcast, but Sega has never verified this claim. With the name in mind, things might be looking up for the Dreamcast and ultimately for Sega. On the 21st of May 1999, the Dreamcast was shown to the world at the Sega New Challenge Conference. Their plan was to release the system in November of 1998 in Japan. With that announcement, it seemed that Sega's plan for launch was a bit odd though. Sega wanted the Dreamcast and the Saturn to go in parallel, with the Saturn focusing on 2D games and the Dreamcast focusing on 3D games. The main issue was that the Saturn was still holding its ground in Japan, so many Japanese developers felt it was unnecessary to release games for the Dreamcast. That didn't seem to bother Sega enough to care, however. You see, Sega anticipated a release date of 1999 for the PlayStation 2. With that in mind, Sega wanted to build up titles and developers ahead of the PS2 launch in hopes to stall Sony's efforts. On May 27, 1998, Bernie Solar then took the stage at E3, coming to restate that the Dreamcast did in fact exist and that it would be coming to North America in the fall of 1999. The plan was to have 20 to 30 total games at launch, though none of these games were shown off at E3, only tech demos. Later in 1998 at the Windows World Expo Tokyo, Microsoft showed up upcoming Windows products. One of these included the Windows CE compatible Dreamcast. This showed off the console in a prototype form, but was quite similar to the final edition. Then on August 22nd, Sega dropped their system seller for the Dreamcast. Sonic Adventure was finally revealed after being in secret development for years. Revealed by Yuji Naka himself and the full team, it was shown running on final hardware, and was shown to be pushing 4 million polygons per second, which was over the 2 to 3 million predicted for the hardware. Launch day, however, was getting closer for Sega, and after announcing Sonic Adventure, it seemed that they had finally shown their hand, and were indeed betting on winning. On November 27, 1998, Sega's new console hit store shelves in Japan with a launch price of 29,000 yen, or roughly $300 in America. Prior to launch, however, things were already going poorly for Sega. First, they had an issue with NEC. NEC was unable to manufacture the required amount of Power VR2 chips, with Sega initially planning to deliver 500,000 consoles for the launch of the Dreamcast. Due to these manufacturing limitations, they were only able to produce a total of 150,000 units. Sega even estimated that they could have sold an additional 200,000 to 300,000 units if they had sufficient supply. With 4 games available at launch, July, Pen Pen Trilcellan, Virtua Fighter 3 TB, and Godzilla Generations, Virtua Fighter 3 TB would prove itself the king again, debuting second in the software charts for the week. Godzilla, Pen Pen, and July would take the 16th, 21st, and 25th spots, respectively. Though the launch was a decent success for Sega when it comes to finances, a majority of systems were pre-ordered, and due to the lack of stocks, current CEO Ira Majiri was dismayed that they had failed to distribute 200,000 systems to retailers for the launch period. For the rest of the launch window, Sega had devised a plan to launch a game a week for 4 weeks after the console had hit store shelves. This too was unfortunately interrupted. Blue Stinger, Geist Force, Sonic Adventure, Evolution, Incoming, Monaco Grand Prix Racing Simulation 2, and 7th Cross Evolution all had planned releases between December 3rd and December 23rd. Blue Stinger was first to be delayed with a new launch date of March 1999, and Geist Force was fully cancelled. Evolution was delayed until January 21st, and Monaco Grand Prix was pushed back to March 11th. Sonic Adventure was even delayed from its release on the 17th to release on the 23rd. Capcom's Resident Evil Code Veronica, a hit Dreamcast game, was also planned for the Dreamcast launch window, but was also hit with a delay until fall of 1999. The aim was to sell a total of 500,000 units by the end of 1998 and 1 million by the end of March 31st. Sega only managed to sell 900,000 units by the 31st, but did sell over a million by the end of May. Along with that, about 1/3 of customers with the Dreamcast logged onto the internet, with the Dream Passport service included, which greatly exceeded expectations. Like the Saturn, however, sales began to dip across 1999, with some reports stating that the Nintendo 64 might have outsold it a few times that summer. In June, at the Sega New Challenge Conference 1999, they announced a price drop to 19,900 yen, or roughly $200. With the price drop and launch games dropping in price as well, sales jumped 10,000%. And with the release of Seaman in July, it seemed as though the Dreamcast was doing well enough. Though sales were a bit disappointing, what mattered most was the launch of the Dreamcast in America. In the summer of 1999, Sega began running ad campaigns to tease the newest console to the American public. Titled the It's Thinking marketing campaign, the Dreamcast's beautiful orange swirl and a launch date of 9/9/99 were prominently displayed. However, there was one main issue with the campaign. Sega forgot to show the public that it was indeed a video game console. Now, this might seem weird in today's context, but remember that back in the 90s, video games weren't the multi-billion-dollar industry they are today. Hearing the name PlayStation is very common today, and if someone said PlayStation 5 near you, just about everyone would know it's the new PlayStation console. If you were an average person in your New York apartment and saw an ad on TV with the vague tagline, "It's Thinking," and then saw an orange swirl with maybe the mention of the word Dreamcast, you would probably have no clue as to what was going on. In fact, according to their test market, only 45% of people knew that a Dreamcast was coming, and even fewer knew what a Dreamcast even was. Despite this weird screw-up, the Dreamcast had pre-order sales of at least 200,000, with some reports stating 250,000 and even getting closer to 300,000. This nearly doubled or tripled the amount of pre-orders that the original PlayStation had in 1995. With that in mind, Sega dubbed the Dreamcast as the most anticipated video game console in history. Whether that was true or not was yet to be seen. On 9/9/99, the Dreamcast officially hit the North American market. It had a price of $199 US and had a total of 18 launch titles. For comparison, the Japanese launch price was around $299 US and had 4 games. Sega decided to wait to launch the Dreamcast in America specifically to analyze the situation and to fix any mistakes they made during the Japanese launch. For the launch titles, Sega had worked closely with Midway Games to ensure that there were more than 4 games at launch. Hydro Thunder, Mortal Kombat Gold, NFL Blitz 2000, and Ready to Rumble Boxing were all developed by Midway and all released the same day as the Dreamcast. Along with those 4, the Dreamcast also launched with Soul Calibur, Sonic Adventure, NFL 2K, Blue Stinger, and many, many more. Some games, however, like Godzilla Generations, just didn't launch in the West due to poor critical reception. 15,000 retailers across America were given their share of Dreamcast for launch, and around 400 stores even took part in special launch parties for the console. This included celebrities Sega had hired, including BNL guitarist singer Ed Robertson, Baywatch star Donna D'Errico, Vern Troyer, famous for Mini-Me in the Austin Powers movies, a Playboy cover girl named Rena Mero, and even Minnesota Vikings players Tony Williams and Dwayne Rudd. Funny enough, Final Fantasy VIII released on the same day as the Dreamcast, and there are some reports of players who were initially at stores just to buy that game, ended up picking up Dreamcasts as well. By the end of the day, the Dreamcast and its software had totaled over $97 million. Every single Toys R Us had sold out by 1 p.m. that afternoon. Within the first 4 days, the Dreamcast managed to sell over 400,000 units. By the end of 2 weeks, it had crossed the 500,000 mark, selling 514,000 units. Hoping the Dreamcast would sell 1 million consoles by the end of 1999 and 1.5 million by the end of March, Sega's senior vice president Chris Gilbert told Next Gen Gaming that, in light of the past 24 hours, we are now re-evaluating these forecasts. Sega even brought up that Star Wars: The Phantom Menace had only brought in roughly $65 million during its opening weekend, and that the $97 million figure was more than the iMac had brought in. The Dreamcast, however, hadn't made a profit yet with that 97 million number and had a ways to go. Like every console launch, unfortunately, the Dreamcast had its issues. In particular, a batch of Ready to Rumble boxing and Sonic Adventure discs were defective. Regardless, the launch period was viewed as quite the success. Even Final Fantasy VIII's launch didn't seem to make a dent in Sega's cash flow. Sega did, however, have trouble keeping up with demand when it came to consoles, VMUs, and controllers. On Tuesday, November 23rd, the Dreamcast had officially passed 1 million machines sold, only taking 2.5 months to reach that number. This meant that the Dreamcast was the fastest selling video game machine in North America. Sega not only boasted that, but also boasted that it had a 3-to-1 software to hardware ratio. The Dreamcast so far looked to be a hit. Unfortunately though, it didn't target the right enemy. Sony's PlayStation currently held the top spot of market share, with Nintendo's N64 in second and the Saturn in third. With the launch of the Dreamcast, it didn't exactly cut into the PlayStation's market share. Instead, it cut into Nintendo's. Electronics Boutique claimed that Nintendo 64s were being traded in for the Dreamcast at 3 times the rate of the PlayStation. With that though, Sonic Adventure and Soul Calibur not only managed to top the Dreamcast sales charts, but also the overall sales charts. By January of 2000, Sega had managed to move 1.5 million Dreamcast consoles. However, the continued popularity of the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation still proved to be better, with the Nintendo 64 selling 1.9 million units, and the PlayStation 1 selling 3.3 million units, all during Q4 of 1999. This is also believed to be due to a rise in popularity of video games in general. Remember that Pokemon Red and Blue had released a year prior, and Pokemon Snap, Stadium, and Pinball all released in 1999. So, the Pokemon craze in America had just started. At the end of the first quarter, March 31st, 2000, Sega had revealed that roughly 2.5 million Dreamcasts had been sold, and 13.83 million pieces of software had sold as well. Within 5 months of initial release, Sega was able to bring the Dreamcast market share to a respectable 20%. Sega seemed to be back in the race, but how long would that last? Here's a hint. Not very. With the Dreamcast performing up to and above expectations in America, things seemed to be going well for Sega. A large rectangular shadow was being cast on every move that Sega made, however, and that was, of course, the PlayStation 2. With rumors swirling since the mid-90s, there was no doubt that Sony was going to make another console. The PlayStation 1 was a huge success, being able to beat out the fairly lame Sega Saturn and even their former business partner's console, the Nintendo 64. Word had begun to leak in 1997 that the new console would indeed have backwards compatibility, a built-in DVD player, and even be able to connect to the internet. And finally, on March 1st, 1999, the PlayStation was shown off to the world. On display, they showed no playable games. However, there were tons of technical demos available to show, featuring Gran Turismo, Final Fantasy VII, Crash Bandicoot, Tekken, and Ridge Racer. Most of these would never really materialize on the PS2, or would at least materialize in different forms. Along with that, Sony even inflated their numbers for the power of the PS2, stating it would be able to render millions of textured polygons, which, with the VRAM that was included, would make that literally impossible. This in turn caused a huge focus shift from the media, with some gaming outlets claiming it was 20 times more powerful than the Dreamcast, and even 100 times more powerful than the PS1. Both of these claims were wildly inaccurate, especially since no real games had been shown running on the machine. With the internet starting to become a normal part of most people's lives, Sony also announced the potential of playing games over the internet, coming as early as 1999. No online servers would end up coming to the PS2 until July 2001 in Japan, August 2002 in the US, and June 2003 in Europe. And early models of the PS2 even required you to purchase a network adapter, with one not coming built into the PS2. All of these things did not stop the PlayStation 2 from having an enormous amount of hype behind it. Sony not only had the marketing, but they had the brand recognition, and they had a lot of people waiting for this console. After a very successful launch in Japan, Sony had their sights aimed towards America. Launching October 26, 2000, the PlayStation not only brought in an estimated $250 million on the first day, but also sold through over 500,000 consoles. Both numbers blew the Dreamcast out of the water. And for comparison's sake, remember that the Dreamcast made 97 million on launch day and sold 514,000 units in 2 weeks. Many consumers had held off on the Dreamcast simply because the PS2 was coming soon, and it seemed to be very evident. With the PlayStation 2 being a monster when it came to sales, it seemed evident that the Dreamcast wouldn't be able to compete. Now on the horizon happened to be 2 other consoles, the Nintendo GameCube and the newcomer, Microsoft's Xbox. The PlayStation had managed to snuff out the possibility of a Sega comeback, and with the GameCube and Xbox looking to launch sometime in 2001, it seemed less and less likely that Sega would continue to run in the hardware race. What's most interesting when it comes to the Dreamcast's downfall isn't that the PlayStation 2 outright killed it. In fact, as with the Sega Saturn, it seemed as though some of the fault could be blamed on internal struggles within Sega itself. In May of 2000, Sega had replaced Shoichiro Irimajiri with Isao Okawa. Nakayama himself, who had been there since Sega's rise to fame with the Genesis, also left the company. Okawa lacked faith in both the Saturn and the Dreamcast, and by 1999, Okawa was even claiming that the Dreamcast would be Sega's last console. Okawa had a vision of Sega becoming a third-party, online-centric software developer, and this sentiment was soon shared with other higher-ups at Sega. Peter Moore, Charles Belfield, and David Rosen all seemed to agree that third-party was the way to go, and that making hardware was just too risky and expensive. Near the end of 2000, Sega started to issue statements saying that they had a desire to work on other non-Sega platforms, including PDA's, Bandai's WonderSwan, and even the Game Boy Advance. They even had some plans to license a DC chip, which was essentially Dreamcast technology that could be used in DVD players. Then, Acclaim Entertainment accidentally revealed that there were some ports of hit Sega games in the works, including 18-wheeler American Pro Trucker. After Okawa's promotion, there were even more rumors of Crazy Taxi and Seaman both being ported to the PS2, but these rumors were denied by Sega of America at E3 of 2000. For the American market, Belfield denied rumors of ditching the console at a November 2000 press conference, and even announced that Sega was indeed developing the Dreamcast technology, not discontinuing it. Even going as far to suggest that the Dreamcast was a brand, hoping it would appear on other devices, possibly DVD players, but never on rival consoles. Belfield even stated that he was not aware of any PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube ports in development. Despite some internal reluctance and many believing Sega could still pull it off, Sega of Japan decided to pull the plug on the Dreamcast soon after. On January 31st, 2001, Sega officially announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast after March 31st, 2001. With the announcement came that they were indeed switching to third-party software development. With the death of the Dreamcast announced, units were reduced to just $99, then further reduced to $79, and eventually only $49.95 to be cleared out of stores. Sega's final numbers at the end of the fiscal year, being March 31st, claimed the Dreamcast had sold 8.2 million units and 51.36 million software units, though the official numbers after discontinuation would end up being 9.13 million units sold. This, however, was unable to surpass the total number of the Sega Saturn, which was 9.26 million. To be fair, the Dreamcast had achieved more in a few months in America than Sega was able to in years. On April 14, 2001, Sega attended Game Jam. Yuji Naka himself had just won numerous awards for Phantasy Star Online, and as a tribute to the now dead console and the games that were still going to launch for it in 2001, Naka was joined by Shenmue designer Yu Suzuki and longtime Sega game planner and producer Noriyoshi Oba to give the final sign-off of Sega's last console. As a console ahead of its time in technology and scope, the Dreamcast is a fantastic system. Despite this, and despite having such hits as Sonic Adventure 1, Sonic Adventure 2, Shenmue, Skies of Arcadia, Phantasy Star Online, Soul Calibur, Ikaruga, Crazy Taxi, Seaman, Jet Set Radio, Space Channel 5, Grandia 2, and many more, the Dreamcast was unfortunately unable to capture the hearts and minds of America, Japan, and Europe away from the PlayStation 2. internal struggles, the announcement of the GameCube and Xbox, and financial losses that all started with the failure of the Saturn had eventually caught up to Sega. The Dreamcast was never able to directly compete with the Xbox or the GameCube, with Sega even adding support to both of those consoles at launch. Would Sega still be in the console wars today if they hadn't flubbed the launch of the Sega Saturn? Would a different head of the company that was more committed to making the Dreamcast a success have changed the outcome? Hopefully, there's a parallel universe out there where Sega continued making consoles. Here in this world though, Sega's been able to continue their legacy by simply making great games. While many fans will miss the days where there was more than just Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony, that won't stop many of us from enjoying what was and thinking about what could have been. Thanks for watching.